This is the second in our series of the Commedia by Dante, which is part of the course on Dante and T.S. Eliot. The reflection last week was on the Inferno, and as Virgil and Dante leave the Inferno, there's a lovely comment where they say, "Thence we came forth to re-behold the stars." I was thinking in the re-beholding the stars in Lord of the Rings when Frodo and Sam are in Mordor, and for a moment the clouds separate and they re-behold the stars and they see there is far, far more. In one sense, the Inferno in the Commedia is like Mordor in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and essential to understand there are these significant overlaps, both being medieval scholars in many ways, the Inklings, and then Dante himself emerging from a medieval classical vision of formation and the nature of the journey through time. And I'll touch on some of those as I go through the Purgatorio, for the simple reason that there's all sorts of affinities, connections, dots to connect between what Dante's doing and what Tolkien is doing and what Lewis is doing and what, for example, Rowling is doing in Harry Potter as well. They're drawing from a motherlode of images of the human journey. So Dorothy Sayers, who translated the Inferno and the Purgatorio, died as she was finishing the Paradiso, has this to say. As she says, it is the best, the least known, the least quoted, and yet the most loved of all the three books. The Purgatorio is the longest in time frame in the Commedia, which makes sense because our journey through time takes time. And the journey of self-understanding and what we are to let go of, what we are attached to, what we cling to, is often a difficult to do. And we need gracious people, merciful people who are with us on the journey. And so the Purgatorio, in terms of the time frame of the Commedia, it's the one that takes the longest. And what Dante is obviously suggesting is that the journey through time takes time to work on those areas of our lives in which the dross has to be burned, the chaff has to be sifted away, and in the process to be merciful and gracious with one another in that journey. And the movement away from the Inferno, which is important, because in the Inferno, what we have essentially in the Inferno is either people who don't want to be honest with those elements in their lives which are causing them in many ways to come to a dead end, causing them broken relationships, causing them to turn on one another, causing them to be addicted, causing them to be driven, almost like whips or the Furies driving them on, and they don't want to face into that. And so on one level, they're rationalizing their behavior, which is leading to the consequences in the lives they're living in the Inferno. You have others who can be acutely aware that the path they have taken is taking them to lower levels of self-understanding, shrinking them as a human being. As the Inferno is, it starts at the top and then gradually narrows at the bottom. They can be aware that, in fact, the path they're on is leading to a dead end. It's leading to a thinning out of them as a human being, but their will is paralyzed. And many people can be cognitively aware that the choices they're making are leading to hurtful consequences to themselves, to relationships, to many others, work environments, religious context. They can be acutely aware of this, but their will is tethered in that sense. And so it's one thing to be aware of an issue that has to be faced into. An alcoholic, a drug addict can be aware of that, but that doesn't mean the will is acting on what is known. And so in the Inferno, what is going on is a paralysis of two levels. One, a rationalizing of one's own narcissism or one's egoism, justifying it, a refusal to look at deeper elements that are causing a person to be in the Inferno with others, or being aware of it but refusing to act on it. And this is the paralysis of the will itself. So many people can talk about change, they can talk about moving in a new direction, but they never do it, and they're constantly, it's like wheels spinning in the mud again and again and again. And so as Dante and Virgil gradually come out of the Inferno and move into the Purgatorio. What's fascinating at two things. First of all, they meet Cato, a very important classical person. It's a fascinating reason why Dante would have chosen Cato. He does embody the best of the classical virtues, a person who lived with great integrity in the midst of many challenges. But in many ways, he was a moralist, and sometimes a moralist who holds strongly to significant convictions can also sometimes not be merciful and generous and kind to others in the midst of moral crisis in their journey. But Dante sees in Cato a person at least embodies at one level the best of natural law, the cardinal virtues of the classic world, and he's the one who greets them as they begin to enter the Purgatorio. Significant also that it is where you do not get a constellation or a great number of angels in the Inferno, even though it exists. Now the company of support is beginning to emerge, and the boats begin to cross the water of the angelic host. Very, very similar, again, returning to Tolkien, of the elves. The angels, in many ways, in Dante, become the elves in Tolkien. They become beings who assist. They're beings who are sensitive at a higher level. They're there to assist humans who do not have quite the capacity in terms of their natures. And so as Dante and Virgil move into the Purgatorio, they are assisted across the water by the boats of the angels that move them on through much, in fact, of the Purgatorio. The presence of the angelic host is there, cheering them on, supporting them on the journey. One of the first figures that Dante and Virgil meet in the Purgatorio is an artist, a poet, a friend of Dante when in Italy and Florence. And what Dante's getting at here also is beware of the attraction of just the artistic mode or the aesthetic mode as a way of knowing. Dante himself being a poet and an artist. It's necessary but not sufficient. What goes beyond just the moralism of Cato and the aesthetic element of his friend in the lower levels of the Purgatorio. And Dante's noting this right away is that the aesthetic can have an immense appeal. It can be very attractive in terms of drawing forth, evoking a higher level of understanding of meaning, of purpose, beauty itself, drawing. But what lies beyond the aesthetic, don't make it an end in itself. It's but a sign and a poster to something yet deeper and further, which is the mystical, the contemplative. And the same with the moralist of Cato, be also aware of reducing the quest. And of course, when we get to Beatrice, when we get to Matilda, when we get to Bernarda Clairvaux, higher up and particularly into the Paradiso, but the higher levels of the Purgatory, we begin to see that moralism in and itself, ethics in and of itself, the cardinal virtues in and of themselves are not enough. Even also the aesthetic, artistic element. There's something deeper that calls forth fuller depths within human longing, human restlessness, human turning to meaning, and part of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity are a part of that. And so this is why love is so central to what Dante's getting at in the Divine Comedy. And as we move through this, Virgil himself expands on what is the nature of love, defective love, excessive love, all these different types of love that distort something good, because out of the longing of love and unity, great virtue can emerge, but also deep and destructive vice can emerge at the same time. So Virgil's reflections with Dante, since love is really the center, the core, the alpha and omega of the Commedia, then the question is often the longing for meaning, for unity, for meaningful relationships, deeper is valid, but where we turn can be destructive. It can be the greatest good, but it can be the greatest commedia, as it were, the greatest good. It can also lead to the most destructive tragedies in life. And Virgil is very insightful in unpacking and understanding this. And Dante would have understood it in his own life, because this was constantly an issue for him as he was trying to find his way in meaningful relationships. and the bypaths that can be taken that lead to hurt and harm when not understood in a proper discerning way. And so as the Purgatorio goes place, it's also an unpacking what is the nature of the gold of true love versus what are the counterfeits of love in terms of the objects or the people or the situations people are drawn to in terms of meaning and purpose. Because love, above all else in the classical and Christian tradition, is a longing. And it's a longing for unity, a longing for a deeper and fuller meaning. And that can take place in relationships. And some people turn to religion, they turn to politics, they can turn to education, they can turn to a variety of things that they hope by picking from the fruit of that tree, it's going to fulfill them, but often it can, in fact, deceive and betray them. And in the Purgatorio, part of it is the purging of the disordered understandings of desire so that the real mature notions of desire emerge. And this is where the burning takes place in the discerning of the longings of and the desire of love itself for its true end, for its true unity, for its true connection in that sense. Some of the figures we meet in the Purgatorio are people who in their lives knew the good, they longed for the good, but they always delayed. They always found reasons not to go on that particular journey. It's what T.S. Eliot talks about in the Four Quartets as people who are distracted by distraction by distraction. And so on the one hand, they'll acknowledge what is important in their life, but on the other hand, they're constantly distracted by a multiplicity of diversions. We call that faffing today. People, one hand, are moving in a certain direction which they think is important, which they're committed to, but they're constantly interested in this distraction and that distraction. It's what the Romans called in the classical world, give people their bread and circuses. And so many of the people in the lower level of purgatory have to purge their tendency to be perpetually distracted about things of secondary and tertiary importance and get much more focused on the primary issues. It's a similar issue that comes up in the Purgatory of sloth. When Dante is talking about sloth, he's just not talking about lazy people. He's talking about people who are busy about things that really don't matter in any significant sense. It's what Shakespeare talks about in a couple of his great dramas, Much Ado About Nothing. And people can spend much of their lives in terms of going round and round like in a carousel, much ado about nothing. And if it becomes more political, then it can be all the sound and fury signifying nothing as well. So Dante was acutely aware of, as they ascended the various levels up the Mount Purgatory, of people whose hearts were good, whose longings were right. They were no more in the inferno. They realized if they were going to grow, mature, become who they were meant to be, in fact, is that they had to deal with their tendencies to misunderstand how one prioritizes desires, or what Augustine would call the amor, the ordering of desires. And so as one moves up through the purgatory, it's examining how people can get distracted, they can get diverted, how they can be blown about by 1,000 either external attractions, temptations. And of course, our culture specializes in going from one thing to another in the hope that by attaining, that somehow a deeper meaning will be attained. But often those are just mirages, or what the medieval would call cellars of smoke, with no substance to them. And a lot of the purgatory is about discerning the cellars of smoke, and how people, if they're not discerning, or if they can see what the issue is, but they don't act on it, again, this is a particular failure of the will. And so the purgatory, at its lower levels of the canto, dealing with pride, they deal with envy, and then they deal with wrath in terms of people who have short fuses and anger. And this is often an issue when people feel their own wishes and wills are being betrayed, or things are not working out. Anger can be an explosive thing, and wrath is one of those things, or anger, certainly in lower levels of the purgatory, that have to be purged. And anytime a person senses the anger, wrath emerging either within themselves or towards others, or in a situation they can't control, Um, where's that coming from? Dante's essentially, in terms of the roots of distraction, not just the fruits of it, because wrath and anger is a fruit that comes from a much deeper root in the human soul and an understanding of the self. And so envy is also is a person feels they don't have what they would want. They look at other people, they compare themselves with others. Their life has not been what they hoped it would be. And then they begin to look in all sorts of directions and feel deeply dissatisfied. And then they're driven to somehow feed that dissatisfaction by the accumulation of experiences, the accumulation of possessions, the accumulation of information, and what Dante's getting at is, where is this coming from? And merely the symptoms, not dealing with the root cause. And in the Purgatorio, it's getting to that root cause and purging that particular element within a person. And so anger is always a key element. The other would be when in time and history, and of course Dante in time and history was very involved with some of the most tumultuous political events in Florence and in Italy in his time. And some of his major opponents at the time, who differed very strongly, who turned on one another, who polarized, we would be similar to the culture wars of today, and canceling one another out in woke culture. This was very much front stage in Dante's time as well, in Italy and Florence. So these were bitterest enemies in the political, social, economic context of the time. Now, when they move out of that experience of time, history, and politics, when they go through the inferno in the Purgatorio, they have to learn to forgive one another for the way they treated one another within the politics of the time in Italy, as well as larger European culture and civilization of the time. This is why within the Purgatorio itself, interestingly enough, the Purgatorio, not only are there is the natural virtues or the cardinal virtues, and there's the theological virtues, but as one gets higher up in the Purgatory, the Beatitudes play a very important role as well. You also get Beatitudes, you get Beatrice. Interesting, Beatrice comes right out of the notion of the Beatitudes. And so the deeper formation of what Dante is getting at in the Beatitudes is the significant role of the Beatitudes in formation and what has to be purged in that regards. So one of the key Beatitudes, particularly people who fought one another politically, interpersonal relationships in Florence and Italy at the time, they have to learn forgiveness. So one of the key Beatitudes as they move up through the Purgatory, Dante has to face those people, in fact, who mistreated him, maligned him, caricatured him, but he also had, how did he contribute to that itself? How did he participate in not being a peacemaker at the time? And so these various key actors on the stage of Italian political life, as they get into the Purgatorio and as they see their deeds were inappropriate in time and history in the Inferno, and they move into the Purgatorio, then they have to face one another, and not as opponents, but as actually people on the same journey up Mount Purgatory together. And so forgiveness is central to this journey through the Purgatory, and peacemaking is foundational. And this is a very difficult patch for both his opponents and himself to grapple with forgiveness. Particularly, he himself was sent into exile, and much of his life was in exile because of this. And so the gradual ascent of Mount Purgatory is an ascent of deeper and deeper levels, not just physical distractions and diversions, but soul distractions and diversions and spiritual distractions. And so there's a variety of clerics, and cardinals themselves are in the Purgatorio for actions taken in time, inappropriate actions, and they have to be purged, and they come to recognize, in fact. And so Dante and Virgil meet them on this ascent, on the journey. So as they go higher and higher up Mount Purgatory, the deeper are the issues they have to face, just at the level of physical lust, but also soul lust and spiritual lust as well. But these again are just symptoms. And what's the root of these elements of pride and envy and wrath and the various types of lusts that can emerge. And Dante is trying to walk the person who journeys with him, because that says Dante is every person. And some of these issues in Mount Purgatorio are Dante's issues, others because he was such an astute observer of the human condition. He describes a variety of people, women and men on the journey, who their own struggles and issues were quite different from Dante's. And so, as an observer of the human journey and the human condition, he describes exquisitely, brilliantly, and very insightfully all the different ways that people can lose their way on the human journey, and often have to spend months and years going round and round, and as Rilke would say, the smallest circle turns. As we move higher up the purgatory, we begin to get the transition in many ways for Dante, in which he also has three very significant dreams. If I had chance, I'd go into them a little more. But by cantos 29, 30, and 31, increasingly we're getting the purgation at an ethical level is taking place much deeper than Cato earlier, is the purgation of the false self. So it's just not the virtues, it's just not the vices, it's purging the very notion of being itself and an understanding of identity and what it is all about. And so as he moves higher up in this process, he begins to realize there's two things going on. One is the tensions between the contemplative and the active. And in these higher levels, the upper reaches of the Purgatorio, the understanding of the activism has to be purged, but a misunderstanding of the vita contemplativa has to be deepened and purged. And how are those two elements to be brought together? We live in a period of time in which the vita activa is very much priorized, lionized, as the means by which we define what it means to be human. And the contemplative, the slowing down, the solitude, the stillness, is minimized. But in the medieval world, which Dante was recalling, so he takes two stories. One is the story of Rachel and Leah. Rachel embodies the contemplative, Leah the active, and he looks at how those two have to be brought together. But they have to do that properly, one has to understand how the active life has to be purified, as well as the contemplative, and how do they marry one another. So the Leah, Richard of St. Victor deals with this a great deal. The Victorine tradition, medieval theologians, contemplative theologians grappled with this. They would fast forward that, of course, to the Mary Martha example. And so Jacob himself, in that sense, becomes, in the Old Testament sense, an attempt to marry the vita activa, which was Leah, had to work 7 years to grapple with what did it mean to live in this world in a meaningful way and find one's way. But then Rachel was at the far end of it, and she embodied the vita contemplativa. But Rachel and Leah need to be held together, just as Mary and Martha need to be held together on the further ascent. When one goes up higher, and this is where Beatrice plays a very important role. We think of Beatrice or Beatrice in the Divine Comedy. She really becomes, if we look at Lord of the Rings, she's essentially the Galadriel. Very, very high in terms of her integrity, the role she plays. Dante, though, has to learn. He has a very idealized view of Beatrice, as if someone she's going to fulfill all his desires. And of course, how we read Beatrice, there's so many levels, from the literal to the allegorical to the tropological to the moral to the mystical. So who is Beatrice in the Commedia, as well as Dante's early work? But on the one hand, he thinks he's ascended the mount with Virgil. Statius, another very important early writer, has joined him on this journey. So he assumes now Beatrice is with him, that all his troubles will be finished. But whoa, actually Beatrice comes at him pretty firm and solid. This is not the lady that he thought was going to ease all his problems and was going to comfort him with like a kindly mother. She reprimands him sternly for, in fact, his dishonesty at a variety of levels, his shirking from what it means to be a person, his refusal. So he's dealt with some of the issues in Mount Purgatory, but she comes at him, fire burning and eyes glazing, and saying, listen, you've got to do a lot more work here, Dante. And until he's willing to do that, she almost comes across as a very stern schoolmaster. And he's brought to tears because he thought, finally, I put in all this difficult work. Virgil's now finally behind me. And it seems that I've dealt with my demons, my issues, but have you really? Have you really? You've got to go deeper yet. And it's Beatrice who like fire herself, is going to draw him into yet greater depths of what he has to let go of. He plays at being on a journey. He seems to be ascending, but in fact, when he actually really meets true love that calls forth what we are actually meant to be, it brings Dante to tears. It brings him down because he realizes he still has not gone to places he has to go to be purified in that sense. And this is why to get to Beatrice, he has to go through a fire, a burning fire. And this is why I've called this talk the deifying fire. And he's hesitant, he's fretful. And Virgil essentially says to him, you're never going to get to the other side until you are willing to allow those things in yourself to be burned that you don't want to let go of. And so fire becomes a very key figure in much of the Christian tradition, as in other traditions also, of that which has to be burned from within us, but which we don't want to be burned. We cling to, we get attached to, we get addicted to. And so Dante can only really meet Beatrice, and he thinks when he's gone through the fire that he's dealt with everything. But no, on the far end of the fire, there's Beatrice waiting for him, and he thinks, look at his position is that, look at what I have given, look at what I have done, look at the struggle I've been through to live a life what I think of greater impurity. And she says, no, much, much further to go yet. And so the initial confrontation between Beatrice and Dante, some commentators wonder what's going on here in terms of her harshness with him in many ways, but it's a deeper and it's a tougher love that in fact she's engaging Dante with. And then we meet again the river of Lethe, the level of forgetfulness. And there's the other river, what called Unoa. This is a term that some would argue, scholarly, Dante has invented it, or it's a term people can't find really the roots of. But it's anytime in Greek you get an like utopia, we get is the good place, utopos, in that sense. She's brought together two terms. Lethe is forgetting who you once were, who you thought you were meant to be. So Dante is baptized, as it were. He has to go under the waters that spring from above. And this is where you get some fascinating metaphors, mixed metaphors in the Purgatorio, because at the top of a mountain, you're not likely to have waters gushing forth. And so he's working with a variety of mixed metaphors, but they all play their significant role. It's the return to the new paradise, the new Eden. But the other river one is the forgetting who you thought you were at one level. Unoma, it also comes from Greek nous. So our very new being is emerging. And all those things we thought we were, that we have to let go on in the human journey. And until we do it, we're not prepared to go into the next step of Paradiso itself. And the Purgatory, it's the journey. Again and again, we think on the journey we've dealt with our issues, but as soon as we take the next step up Mount Purgatory, there's new issues that we're totally unaware it would come from the subconscious, the unconscious, through our history, hurts and pains and disappointments and painful memories. All of those things have to surface. They all have to go, and then they go into the water of which washes them away. And that's the water of Lethe, which we initially encounter at the bottom of the Inferno, but then the water becomes even more cleansing the higher up we go, and the deeper water comes along, which washes away our very understanding of our false being, our false self. So it's a baptismal experience for Dante on this journey, and then the finale of the final cantos are the pageant that comes through. The great church tradition comes through in all of its fullness, almost the church triumphant, not just the church militant, but in fact the great epic vision of what this stands for. And Dante is drawing images from Revelation and many of the Hebrew prophets, and It's this massive coming out of the great forest, and here you get two different elements of the forest. The forest he starts with, in which he's confused, and now the new deified forest, in which all of nature, all of humanity, and God himself has brought this triangular relationship together. We meet this a little earlier in Matilda, before Dante meets Beatrice. There's Matilda, and then Pia a little earlier, which we get our word pietism from. And so there's this renewal going on as people, and Dante in this case, and the classical tradition, is letting go of misunderstandings of the self, the vices, false self. You get this unity coming together of God, nature, and humanity once again. But there's hints of it in Purgatorio, higher up, of the new world coming into being, Eden being restored, the rivers of life, the baptisms of transformation, and then the great liturgy of eternity with all the saints, the men and women, appearing, which is then going to lead Dante even higher up with Beatrice and others into the Paradiso. And so the Purgatory is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the longest. It is the longest of the trilogy, but that's the nature of the human journey. We think we've dealt with issues, only to discover we have other issues to deal with, and we deal with them, and there's something more we have to deal with. So what Dante's doing comes very, very much as a critique of certain forms of Christianity. Well, I've accepted Christ, therefore I don't have to deal with any significant issues or born-again experiences, which are defined by a one-off 90-degree turn. That's just the beginning, and Dante realized that very clearly. The actual journey of transformation takes more than a lifetime, and this is why we have our short time within time, but the journey as we cross the river, as the boats come and take us, that continues. And depending on where we are in our self-understanding, our relationships with others, some have to deal with the issues in the inferno, others are willing to say, yes, very much in this life I rationalized my behavior. I saw others as the problem on my journey. We idealize ourselves, and that takes a person to the inferno. But when a person has the humility, and this is why humilitas in that classic sense it's the counter to pride, which is one of the vices, obviously, that comes up. And when Dante first enters the Purgatorio, he has a P put on his forehead, which is just the Latin for peccator, which is sin, in that sense. At each level he goes up, one of the P's is erased more and more as he deals with the issues, or he watches others who are dealing with the issues they finally have to let go of, till finally the P is totally erased from his forehead. But what Dante's getting at is the journey of transformation is a long one. It involves great honesty, great courage, great integrity, and anytime we think we've sorted out and we've reached the destination, we only discover there's something new within ourselves that have to be dealt with. And so the Purgatory it's an intricate, it's a subtle, it's a nuanced approach to self-understanding. And just when Dante thinks he's sorted it out, he's realized he's really back at the beginning. And so humility is one of those great virtues. And I mentioned earlier, the Beatitudes is foundational to this transformation. And the Beatitudes supplements and complements the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues as well. So next week then we'll move on to the Paradiso. And do be reading Paul Pearson's trilogy, very important. Also, one thing perhaps, since the course is on Dante and Eliot, if possible, read Dante's Ash Wednesday, because Ash Wednesday is really the story of the transition from the Inferno to the Purgatorio, and I have done a couple of reflections on it. If you just bring up my name in Ash Wednesday, Google it. Very important to get a sense of what Dante was doing as he interacted, or Eliot was doing what he was interacting with Dante, and how Ash Wednesday, which will be moving into Ash Wednesday in a couple of weeks anyway, in mid-February. And so this combination of Eliot and Dante, Ash Wednesday, Inferno, Purgatorio, and as you're reflecting on Purgatorio, also as we get to Eliot, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Sweeney, and many others, Wasteland, which would be the big poem of the Inferno, and the Purgatorio is very connected. So I'll be shuttling back and forth as we move along and into the Paradiso, bringing some of the Eliot stuff in, and then we'll launch right into Eliot in a couple of weeks. So for our next class to be the Paradiso, but if possible, both read of T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday and watch my commentary on it.